Hello, students. This is Dr. Giffone, Benj here once again. We'll be finishing up in this video our exploration of the book of Ephesians for now. I hope that it's been interesting for you and helpful and hopefully provocative, and it inspires you to study the book of Ephesians further. There's obviously a lot here that we could continue to explore. And today, especially, we will be focusing in on two particular sections of the book of Ephesians, the conclusion, that have been the subject of a great deal of controversy and wrestling over the years, over the centuries, passages that have been in some ways misused to justify the treatment of women or of slaves. And then the question becomes for us is how we should think about these passages and whether they actually do, in fact, say the things that they are purport to be saying, or is that a twisting of what people tend to think it means? And then how should we actually use them, or are they just texts that are too dangerous for us to explore, and that we should just kind of gloss over them? You won't be surprised to find that I think that approach is the wrong approach, but that we should actually take it on head on and explore what they actually mean. And in a little bit, my wife Corrie will be coming on to talk about the issue of submission and wives submitting to husbands, and I'm interested to hear the things that she has to say and things that we've kind of learned together over nearly 14 years of being married. So first, let's be reminded of where we are in the structure of the book of Ephesians. So as we said, the first three chapters are instructive in nature, and then chapters 4 through 6 are mainly hortatory, meaning they give exhortation about how the church should be and live and believe, including many practical things. And where we left off last time was in the middle of chapter 5, and I hinted that there is there's not necessarily a great place to divide chapter 5, and this is itself a contentious issue, and you can see, as we'll see, different English translations at least approach the issue differently. And it is significant not just for the sake of discourse analysis or some sort of curiosity, but actually the issue of what submission means is actually at stake in how we divide up these verses. So let's actually see how this works and take a look. So when we look at chapter 5, verse 21 through chapter 6, verse 9, this is what we would call a household code. There are several other codes in the New Testament that provide instructions for how households are to behave, the relationships between husbands and wives, parents and children, and then slaves and masters. These are all very important. The family is an important context in which the mission of the church and God's redemptive mission in the world gets lived out. And so it makes sense that the early Christian communities, including the apostles, would have a lot to say about how households behaved. And so here are some interpretive issues. Again, we can't explore all of these fully, but these are just a limited list of some of the issues of that go into different opinions or different perspectives on the household codes. First, and we'll discuss this at length, what is the relationship between the command to submit to one another in 5:21 and wives submit to your husbands in chapter 5, verse 22? How precisely is the relationship of Christ and the church analogous to a marriage relationship? This is something that's challenging, and obviously all analogies have their limitations, how far they can be taken. Number 3, how do the instructions regarding other relationships, like fathers and children and slaves and masters, compare to the marriage instructions? Number 4, how do these instructions compare to other household codes in the New Testament? How do these, and how do we contextualize these codes within 2TJ, which is Second Temple Judaism, the broad stream of Jewish culture from this time, and then the Greco-Roman world? That's what GRW stands for. And then finally, do these codes represent a final word on these relationships, as in this is to be prescriptive for all time? Or do these constitute a redemptive trajectory towards even greater revolution or evolution of the relationships between the people of God within the family in a community that is supposed to reflect God's ideal for creation and how human beings relate to each other? So, and then if that's the case, which I think almost everyone agrees when it comes to slavery, that that's certainly what it means, how far does the redemptive trajectory extend? And what are we to make of how these texts revolutionize, how far did they revolutionize the understandings of these relationships that were prevalent in that time? So first, let's talk about the issue of where to divide chapter 5 and the command, wives, submit to your husbands, which, as we will see, is not actually in the text itself. That if you see it in the Bible where it says, wives, submit to your husbands, that word submit is not there in the text. Everyone agrees on that. So here's the question, and I've provided a hyperliteral translation here on the screen for you to see. This is my own translation. So it starts in verse 18, picking up perhaps a sentence that's continuing, but I've moved back to the last commands in this sequence of participles that start the series of participles. So, and do not get drunk with wine, that's a command, but be filled in or with the Spirit. That's another command. And then we have a string of participles, speaking, speaking and singing and psalm singing, giving thanks. These are all participles that are generally, the surface level understanding is that it describes continuous action, but in this case, it means more that it's continuing the mood of command, that all of these things are kind of a bundle, that they go together with the command that was stated, the pair of commands, do not get drunk, but be filled with the Spirit. So this is the continuation of the idea of being Spirit-filled. And then you can see verse 21 then continues, self-submitting. It's also a participle. It's not a command directly in terms of the grammar. Self-submitting to one another in the fear of Christ, comma, women to their own men as to the Lord. And notice that the implication there is submitting, self-submitting, but it's not actually stated. It's just implied from the previous verse. Because a man is ahead of the woman, and also Christ is implied, head of the church, he himself the savior of the body. But as the church self-submits, and here's an indicative, not an imperative, but as the church self-submits to Christ, thus also women to the men in everything. Again, it doesn't say women submit to men, but it's perhaps implied from the previous indicative use of self-submitting. Then we have another command, the first actual imperative verbal form from that we've seen since verse 18. Men, love the women as also Christ loved the church. And it continues on. So a few observations here. First, man and woman, when used together in Greek, imply husband and wife. There are no distinct words in Greek for husband as opposed to man or wife as opposed to woman. So when these are paired together, they mean husband and wife generally. Second observation is that we have general imperatives or commands in chapter 5, verse 18, and then participles continuing the imperative mood through verse 21, self-submitting to one another. The next imperative is not till 5:25. Husbands, love your wives. And then verse 22 does not even have a verb, as I've said. It's implied from the participle in 5:21, self-submitting to each other. So it's challenging then when you have a long sentence that doesn't have a natural grammatical conclusion to divide this into paragraphs if we feel the need to do such a thing. So we should note that English translations are divided themselves on whether to associate verse 21 with the preceding section or the succeeding section, and how to deal with the implied self-submission there. So what I've done here is I've provided a comparison of 5 different English translations that are used more commonly. And you can see that the New American Standard, the New King James, and the ESV, the English Standard Version, all tend to be a bit more traditional in putting a break in between verses 21 and 22, which I think is the harder, or the more difficult severing there, and kind of starting a new passage with wives, be subject to your own husbands, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas the NIV and the New Revised Standard kind of put verse 21 off as its own sentence, even though it does continue from verse 20. But yet all of them, except the New American Standard, put submit or be subject in between wives and husbands. But the New American Standard helpfully puts it in italics, which shows us that it's implied. It's not actually present in the Greek text. It's implied from the previous verse. So this is interesting in and of itself, that the New International Version and the New Revised Standard Version are both self-consciously trying to be more egalitarian in their language and in how they present gender issues, and this is one evidence of that. But even so, it's difficult to know where to divide this. But so if we can reach some sort of a conclusion on this, the issue of, whatever the wives submit to your husbands passage could mean, we see that it flows seamlessly out of the previous paragraph that seems to prioritize wisdom, filling with the Spirit, exuberant and consistent worship, including singing and praying and praises, thanksgiving, mutual edification, which is what all the gifts of the Spirit are to be given for, and mutual submission. And so that is where the question of mutual submission, what exactly that looks like, is something that we can address further. So I will give me one moment, and I will pause, and my wife Corrie will join us. Well, as promised, I'm back with my wife, Corrie Giffone. Corrie is a music teacher and full-time and more mom of our children, and also has a degree in biblical studies. And so she wrote all of the same papers and did all the same study in undergraduate that I did myself when I was exploring these issues for the first time. And I'll let you speak for yourself, Corrie. That we both grew up in households where that were tended to be more on the traditional side, at least in terms of the breakdown of or the understanding of this verse. So I can ask you, how did you understand these verses growing up, and how were you taught them? And were you taught them by women, or were you taught them by men, or both?
Right. I grew up in a Christian home. My father was a pastor, and my mother was a stay-at-home mom, and a huge support. Probably was kind of like a full-time job, but a support to my father in his ministry to the church. And she was very content with that role. So it wasn't like she had these aspirations of having her own life or work or ministry and put them aside for the sake of this passage. I think she found joy in what she was doing. But yeah, I remember being taught this passage or this topic, maybe in Sunday school lessons, in sermons, in more explicit and implicit ways throughout my growing up, and just had this overarching idea that first of all, in marriage, the wife is kind of second in authority to the husband, and not a lesser, not lesser in value, but I think it was related to the idea in the creation of Adam and Eve that the wife is a helper for the man. Kind of looking at when there are decisions, decisions that have to be made, you need a structure of whose say matters more. So it's an understanding that the wife can share her opinions, can have just as much intelligence or wisdom, knowledge, and can guide and love and help her family, but is kind of supporting the authority of her husband over the household. But that he bears with that a responsibility before God that is weighty, to guide his household in a strong way. I think it was emphasized that does not require women to obey husbands at all times and in all ways, especially if you have a husband who is not a Christian or is not guiding you in a godly way. Submission gets a little bit more difficult. What does it look like to honor and go along with the views of the husband and the household without still protecting yourself and living in a healthy way. So I don't think I would have had any church environment say, encourage women to continue on in abusive or especially difficult scenarios in that way. I don't know if that's important to note. And it got kind of combined with the issue of like ministry and authority in the church. In my mind, that so the term that our church would have used, our church circles would have used, was a complementary view of marriage, that the wife is complementing or in addition to providing something something of support and help to the husband, filling out what he's able to do. And then in church ministry, men are the head and authority, and a woman should not be over a man. So a woman could not be a pastor, a woman, although I do remember a woman being the children's pastor. So more specific, a woman could not be a head pastor, could not be in a position over a man. So if she was leading, if it was a position where she would be leading men or teaching men from the scriptures, that was not permitted. If she was teaching children or youth or other women, or directing music or working alongside men in some other way, that was acceptable. But she would not be allowed to teach from the scriptures or lead like a prayer or worship from like during a service where men were involved.
What you're saying makes me think of I think when we think about the historical context in which these commands were given as compared to the modern Western context that we both grew up in, it turns out that in fact, women, or in practice, women do exercise leadership in the church, which is a related issue, under the title sometimes of director or like you said,
Mhm.
children's pastor, but even some churches won't designate women as a
Mhm.
children's pastor, but director is fine.
Director. Yeah, it might have been that.
Um, but that, and then even within marriage,
Mhm.
the marriages, healthy marriages, even between the couples that we saw in egalitarian or in complementarian churches that saw men and women as having these distinct roles, and Christ as the husband as the head, as Christ is over the church, we're still in practice in many cases very egalitarian, and wives would work, and not always, but
Mhm.
it varied quite a bit in ways that perhaps people coming forward from the ancient world and seeing the ways that men and women interact in our world on equal terms in
Mhm.
business environments and in church environments, um, it would be surprising how equal men and women actually are in practice. And so this connects to the issue of, what would this have meant in the ancient world? Well, how would these commands have been understood? And in a little bit, you do have to go at some point to do some other things, but I'll talk about the issue of slaves and masters. But maybe you can speak a bit more personally, and we didn't rehearse this, but as you know, in recent years, we started out in marriage maybe with
Mhm.
some implicit understandings, and some that we talked about that were explicit about the way a marriage relationship should be, that were more traditional along these lines. And then um, my thinking, at least theologically, has evolved on these matters. And so we joked about, or Corey's joked about, well, my
Mhm.
husband's become egalitarian, so I guess that means I have to
Mhm.
as well. I have to follow him in that. But can you talk about what does it mean? What does it mean? Where are you currently at in terms of processing these matters, especially given
Mhm.
just the fact that the way we've gone in our 14 years of marriage has been that since the reality has been that since our children have been born, um, there's been more distinct spheres that I have taken more of an active role outside the home, and then yours has been more inside the home. And that's, you could construe that it's not necessarily submission, but maybe more of division of labor. But in fact, it is the case that we discuss at times how it is that we can actually operate on equal terms and coordinate big decisions within our family and make them together, and not just that I'm making them and you rubber stamp them.
Mhm.
I really am putting her on the spot here because we did not
Yeah.
discuss
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. No, that's um, yeah, I think that you have shown respect in trying to include me in decisions. Um, I think we have taken followed a more traditional path where I have been the stay-at-home mom, and then our choices have followed more of your, at least for this part of our lives, more of your studies and career and ministry. And I have tried to come alongside in that and support and find my unique place along the way, sometimes with success and sometimes not. Um, the first instance I remember wrestling with submission was when our children were born, and we switched to a church denomination at that time that baptizes children. And that was new and different in my life. I was baptized as an older child when I was aware of my faith in the Lord and believed I was making a statement of faith in my baptism. And I had studied the issue in depth and talked to others and really wrestled with it. And you felt, convinced to go along with the process of, to join this new church denomination and then to go along with the process of baptism in that church. And I remember talking with the Lord about it and feeling like he was telling me at that point that it was okay if I didn't understand, that you weren't asking us to do something that was immoral, um, and that I could, submit to your desires and knowledge on this issue, and that it would be, your between you and God if this was a wrong choice, to work that out, and that I needed to just follow your leadership of our family in that moment.
Mm.
Some could argue that I was deferring making a decision or a commitment, but I think it worked. Um, I think it was right for that instance and at that time. Um, there have been other times when it has been more difficult for me to to agree with bigger or smaller decisions or the direction that we're going, and that takes more, just in terms of a marriage working out, just more love and patience and communication and listening to one another and submitting to each other and setting
Mm.
aside desires in certain circumstances. And although nothing specifics coming to mind at the moment, but probably times that you have set aside your opinion to go with what I wanted, even if it wasn't what you felt excited about in the moment. So that would tie back to that principle of submitting to one another
Mm.
in Christ. That kind of sets. So I would be of the view that that verse sets up this, this section, and is kind of the overarching principle that we are submitting to one another in love,
Yeah.
as we follow Christ.
I think that
How does that help?
no, that's really great. Thank you. And this is something, again, we've been married for 14 years, not 50 years, and so it's or almost 14 years, and so it's something that we still figure out, and are, it's an ongoing negotiation of this relationship and of what it means to mutually submit to one another. And I think that regardless of whether one is sees this verse as being complementary, from a complementarian or an egalitarian perspective, the emphasis, again, it should be stated and emphasized that it's on the person who's doing the submitting. It doesn't say husbands subjugate your wives, just as it doesn't say to Christians subjugate one another out of regard for Christ. It's submit to one another. It's the emphasis is on the one submitting. Right. And so just as God, if we think about the relationship between Christ and the church, or our own relationships to God, God could force us to submit, and he has the right to do so, but he does not want that. He wants us to voluntarily lay our lives before him and be constantly submitting to him. And so that is within a marriage, as within the Christian community, that's a constant battle within myself to lay myself down for my wife and for my family and for the rest of my community. It's a constant battle for the wife within herself to lay herself down for the husband and for the family and for the community. So this is the ongoing struggle that wherever you put the emphasis, it really all ultimately comes back to, it's about unity, laying down, setting aside oneself for the good of the body.
Yeah, you asked about a shift in that perspective in terms of church ministry. So Benj was ordained in another denomination. If you're not from a background where there's lots of different Protestant denominations, you can tell that there are many with some very minor issues of doctrine, and it gets overwhelming. But we later switched to a church where women can be ordained as pastors, elders, deacons, teachers, an equal footing with men. And that was kind of new and overwhelming for me. And I think at first a little bit painful in making me feel like, well, if this is true, or if this is okay, have the sacrifices I've made
In a more
in a more
traditional
traditional,
paradigm.
yes, in a more traditional paradigm, been unnecessary, or would my life and ministry have taken a different shape, or path, if I had seen these options as options
Mhm.
sooner. That can happen anytime we change our views on something, that there's loss and gain in that. And I was able to see, honestly, I still kind of back and forth on how I feel. I know how Ben feels, but was able to see some examples of women who lead and serve in the church, I think, with respect and grace and wisdom, alongside men. I know there were times, and it might have been more of a cultural thing than a religious thing, but the complementarian, the advocates of the complementarian view would point out ways that, in general, in our society at that time, men were failing to step up as leaders,
Mm.
and women were more pushing to step up as leaders. And it seemed like if women tried to, if no one was filling the roles of leadership, women would jump in,
That was
feeling
something
like, well, we
negative.
have to, whether or not we're supposed to, because
Mhm.
nobody's doing it.
Yeah.
And then men would just kind of, stand
Mhm.
aside and let them,
Right.
well, the women are doing, that's fine, and not take on the responsibilities that they should have before God. So it's an
Mm.
interesting dynamic of it too. But it was good for me to see some churches where it was functioning in a healthy
Mhm.
way,
Yeah.
that people were, of men and women, were able to lead well
Mhm.
together and respect one another in that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that one of the things that I've tried to understand, especially having that change of position, but also not identifying in the, not finding as a helpful identification for myself, the term feminist, is just the belief that society and the church needs both men and women, and that men and women are different on average, and that each man and each woman is different, and each marriage relationship is different, but that each of us images the images God in a unique way, and that the church especially, but also society, needs the unique contributions of men, and specific men, and women and specific women, and that the church is poorly served if men are domineering, or if women are domineering. And so that's, I think everyone can agree with that it needs to be, um, both men and women together, fully living up to all that God has made us to be. And of course, we're never going to fully achieve this, because we're sinful, and Christ can be the perfect husband to the church in a way that a human husband can never be. But we can still move in this redemptive way, which I'll speak about in a little bit. So thank you, Corrie, for sharing this, and yeah, I appreciate it. Well, I hope that was an interesting conversation. And of course, these are issues. It's a live issue for us, and something that's continually evolving in our own understanding, personally and in our marriage. So I hope that's interesting. I hope that's helpful. A few things I want to point out here as we move on and finish on the household codes, and then think about spiritual warfare briefly, is that once again, the relationship of Christ and the church, and how the church is, how that relationship is analogous to the marriage relationship, is really a huge part of the debate. And yet I think almost everybody is in danger of taking this analogy too far, or not far enough. The question of what aspects of the Christ church relationship are translatable for husband and wife, and what are the limits of submission for sinful humans versus submitting to a sinless Christ, a sinless head, is something that, again, there has to always be exceptions. There have to always be this text, even if you take it in the more traditional sense of wives submit to your husbands, it's not that there can never be any exceptions to this, because it's all presuming, starting in verse 18, that this is in the context of a spirit-filled community and a spirit-filled relationship. And there are, of course, situations where, because of hardness of heart, that relationship, the mutual submission between one another within the church breaks down, and also in a marriage, it also breaks down, which is very sad. The Old Testament background for this marriage metaphor is very interesting. We have the book of Hosea, Ezekiel 16, Lamentations, Isaiah 49, which all regard the husband-wife relationship as a picture, or at least use the husband-wife relationship as a picture of Yahweh's relationship to Israel. And especially this metaphor in Ephesians 5, verse 26, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or anything, that she might be holy and without blemish. That could be understood as an allusion to the book of Ephesians 16, and the very shocking parable that is there, where there's washing of Israel as a naked baby that's thrown out into a field, just abandoned, and that Yahweh picks her up there and washes her off and cleanses her and makes her fit for marriage ultimately, which is kind of interesting. And then the question of the clarification at the end, but I am speaking about Christ and the church. What does Paul mean by that? Does he mean that everything he said about the marriage relationship is actually just about Christ and the church and not applied in the marriage? Or what exactly does that mean? That's an important question. So then the next one there, how did the instructions regarding other relationships, father and children, slaves and masters, compare to the marriage instructions? Well, in short, in each case, a standard command for the household member in a subordinate position is then followed by a revolutionary command for the member in a superior position. So it would not have been at all surprising in the Greco-Roman world or in Second Temple Judaism to have an instruction where husbands should love their wives, that wives should submit to their husbands, or that children should obey their fathers, or that slaves should obey their masters. But it would have been surprising to have husbands love your wives and be prepared to lay your life down for them, and also fathers, don't provoke your children, and masters, do not abuse your slaves. So this would have been, there's one that's sort of one that you would accept within the culture, would be widely accepted, but then it's followed by the revolutionary command that don't seem to be dependent upon one another. So the children should obey their parents, regardless of whether the parents take the non-antagonistic and rather constructive attitude toward their children. But it's still, there's the revolutionary reversal of the traditional understanding that we'd find. And then, within Jewish culture and Greco-Roman culture, with respect to women and slaves as well, that there was the understanding that women were inferior. Aristotle thought women were inferior biologically and psychologically, and that certain people were born into slavery and were just not fit to lead or be in positions of power. And this understanding, especially of women, as far as I understand it, really continued until the mid 20th century, when it was still being debated up until the 1950s in the West, whether women could be intellectually equal to men, or whether they were just sort of slightly inferior copies of men who had these other biological differences. So that is something that is different in our day than it would have been in the ancient times, just as understanding of slavery is different. We should also point out that the Old Testament already has commands and guidelines for marriage relationships, parent-child relationships, and master-slave relationships that are moving in a direction that gives more gives more concession and more protection for the position in the inferior, the member of the household in the inferior position already. Even though they're not fully egalitarian, it is still something that is moving in that direction. And that's where I think this idea of a redemptive trajectory is helpful, because if it's not as though Paul was saying that this is the way that it should always be in every case, especially with respect to slaves and masters, but that there would also have been the accusation amongst the Christian communities, or from outsiders, that they were trying to overturn society, that they were destroying families, that they were overturning the social order. And Paul, and also the Apostle Peter in First Peter, was concerned and said about this, and said, we are content to remain submissive to these orders insofar as they keep us, they provide order within society, and they also keep us out of the eye of, they deflect attention away from, we only want the gospel itself to be a stumbling block, and not just people going crazy, overturning all the understandings of gender and parent-child relationships and master-slave relationships. And yet, within these texts, there are the seeds of redemption and transformation of society that will start in the family. What would it mean for wives to fully submit to their husbands, but for husbands to fully be willing to lay down their lives? Well, ultimately, that would be a very egalitarian situation, because both would be submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. So ultimately, the seeds of societal family transformation and societal transformation are sown in these texts. So that's what we mean by a redemptive trajectory. And if you're curious about this, you should read Richard Hayes's The Moral Vision of the New Testament, or another book by William Webb, which is Slaves, Women, and Homosexuals, in which he really pulls out this idea of the redemptive ethic, the redemptive trajectory of ethics, but also explores its limits with respect to sexuality. Okay, so some final words now on the spiritual warfare, just some thoughts on this. And I know one of you is writing a paper on this subject, so I don't want to undermine that study or steal your thunder. But when we get to Ephesians 6, 10 and 20, 10 through 20, we see this whole armor of God in order to stand against the wiles of the devil. We've already talked about principalities, powers, world rulers of this present darkness, spiritual forces that are standing by and distraught over the fact that the Gentiles have now come into God's people and are now in full relationship with Yahweh, the God of Israel, because the rebellious powers have failed and actually rebelled in their responsibility to point the nations to Yahweh. And so Christ went and redeemed those people, all of us, for himself, and has put those powers to shame. And so they're unhappy about it. What's interesting is these elements of spiritual warfare have been, they're all from the book of Isaiah, or most of them have precedent in the book of Isaiah. As you can see, the belt of truth or faithfulness around the Messiah's waist. Yahweh himself is the warrior who puts on righteousness as a breastplate and a helmet of salvation. The messenger who brings good news, the evangelist, is the one who's mentioned in Isaiah 52. And then the sword, which is the word of God, is the only offensive weapon in the toolkit here that's in the ensemble in Ephesians 6. And yet it also mentions that the arrows of the evil one will come at us, and that the sword of truth is the only offensive weapon. The shield of faith is what deflects those flaming arrows. So this is a very important passage, and in some ways rather straightforward, but hard to actually implement in our lives. But the emphasis on prayer, the emphasis on the emphasis on standing together as a church and not letting the realities that were explored in the household codes, those power imbalances that would threaten to divide the church, or lead to resentment or anger against one another. Those things need to be, we need to submit to one another so that we can be strong to fight against the powers that exist. And that if we are divided, we will fall. But if we are united and put on this armor together, then we will be successful by the power of God. And that we as the church take on all of these roles, the role of, we follow the Messiah, we follow Yahweh, we follow this messenger and the servant of Isaiah 49. This imagery is now all applied to the church. So those are my thoughts on Ephesians 5:21 through the end of the book. There's a lot to discuss here, and I'm interested to see what questions you may have. And look forward to speaking with you in a little bit.